Americans have been socialized to resent authority. So we have bumper stickers that say question authority. We have restaurants that say no rules. We have car ads that teach us to color outside the lines, and movies about breaking all the rules. Men tend to want wild women, and women sometimes are attracted to bad boys. And even poor Elsa in Disney sings, "No rules for me, I'm free." In the middle of America's distrust of authority come the words of Jesus right at the end of the Gospel of Matthew. In fact, it's the culminating moment of Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus announces in Matthew 28 and verse 18, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." This is the preface of the Great Commission. And the reason the preface matters is because the only way we can do what Jesus teaches us to do in verses 19 and 20, go make disciples, is if we acknowledge the authority of Jesus articulated in verse 18. Jesus has all authority. So I've been asked to speak for 10 minutes on Jesus and his authority. And I just try to think, what could I say that might make a difference? I'm just going to say three things that pop in my head that are really important, I think, for today's moment in discussing the authority of Jesus. And the first thing I want to say is that in the hands of Jesus, authority is a good thing. So what is authority anyway? Authority simply means that you have the right to exercise power over someone else. So authority is different from power. A lot of people have power, but they may not have the right to exercise it. Jesus claims to have not only the power, but the right to exercise that power. So Jesus has the right not only to make the rules, but he has the right to enforce the rules, and he has a right to judge us based on how we react to those rules. And that's actually good news. You see, for a lot of us, we've just been led to think that somehow authority is oppressive, somehow authority works against authenticity, authority restricts us from being who we really were designed to be. But at the end of the day, because Jesus creates us, because Jesus knows us better even than we do, because Jesus has all authority over heaven and earth, every single thing, bodies, money, sex, storms, death, sickness, whatever you name, Jesus has authority over it. Jesus knows better than anybody how to live a good life. And so he has the authority. He claims that authority. In fact, one way to think about it is just to think about what life would look like if we had no authority. So I won't pretend to know everything there is to know about college football, but I'll say this. I've followed enough football to know that the University of Alabama Crimson Tide, sorry to you Auburn fans, is an awesome university with an awesome football team. In fact, if you just set aside for a moment the 1800 football games, those seasons that nobody pays any attention to, no one can hold a candle to what the Crimson Tide has done. 17 championship games, and 6 of those were under coach Nick Saban. Nick Saban, by the way, I think he's like 5'8". He's a small guy, and if you just look at him, there's just not anything in the guy that would make you think you would want to play football for this man. And yet, men line up to play under Coach Saban. You know why? Not because he has no authority, not because he tells everybody go out there and play any way you want to play, not because he encourages so-called authenticity. Authenticity is a good word, but it's often misused. But because he has authority and he knows how to use it well, he conditions, he disciplines, he organizes, he knows how to win. And so under his authority, people leave the program champions. In the same way, Jesus' authority is not a bad thing. Jesus understands the game of life. He knows where it's going. He knows whence it's come. He knows why we're here. He knows what we're supposed to do. Living in his authority in Jesus' hands, is a good thing, not a bad thing. The second thing I want to say, if you're going to live in the authority of Jesus, you have to accept the scriptures that Jesus accepted. So I just want to say this because what I think has happened to some extent in evangelicalism in the last, 30, 40 years in the U.S. and in Canada is that we've gotten to where we really like the red letters of the Bible. And at least some of us feel an invitation to question the black letters of the Bible. And I want to make sure you understand, if you do that, you're not living under the authority of Jesus. 2 reasons I want to say that. First of all, Those 3/4 of the Bible, those 3/4 of the books of the Bible called the Old Testament, Jesus accepted every single word of those. In fact, Jesus is the God of the Old Testament. The very word Jesus means Jehovah saves, Yahweh saves. It's in his name. Jesus isn't some other God. He's not like an eighth God out there. He's not Baal. Jesus is not Mithras. Jesus is the same God you read of in the Old Testament. That God of the Old Testament, that is Jesus. And so Jesus comes and he says, he doesn't come and say, hey, the Old Testament, you need to unhitch yourself from that, let go of that has nothing to do with you. Jesus comes and he says, I tell you the truth till everything has been accomplished, till heaven and earth disappear, he says. Not one jot, not one tittle will disappear from the law until everything has been accomplished. Jesus has commanding respect for the Old Testament. But also Jesus bequeaths his authority to his apostles and his prophets. So those letters of Paul, that work of Peter, James, the book of Revelation, this material was given us by the authority of Jesus. Remember what he says in Matthew 16? He says to Peter, I tell you, you're Peter, on this rock I'll build my church. Gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And Peter and the apostles, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And that explains why when the apostles write, when Paul writes, or when Peter writes, that you routinely say, we're writing the very words of God. What I want to make sure that we understand is that to live in the authority of Jesus is to embrace the entirety of the Scriptures. Only by embracing the entirety of the Scriptures do we get the full authority of King Jesus. And then the third thing I want to say that obedience is not a path to slavery. It's a path to freedom. So again, North Americans who have a problem with authority, we just do. We've been socialized to have a problem with authority. We also have a problem with obedience. Some of it's bad theology. We've been taught that obedience is the opposite of faith, and that's just not true. The Bible over and over again commends obedience. Jesus does in the book of Matthew. Jesus says, not everyone who calls on my name will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but those who do the will of the Father who is in heaven. Jesus wants us to understand that obedience is part of faithful faith. But sometimes we've belittled obedience just because we have a rebellious spirit. We'd rather be king ourselves. And we don't want someone else telling us what to do. What you need to know is that obeying King Jesus is not a path to slavery. It's a path to freedom. Jesus gives us a road, a highway, if you will, that will lead to an awesome life called the kingdom of God. Driving on the road is not a form of enslavement. Refusing to drive on the road is a form of enslavement. Let me give you just one illustration. If you think about Jesus's sexual ethics, in today's world, they would be considered oppressive or regressive or somehow a form of bondage. But you can look at it from the other direction, and you can see the blessing that comes with what Jesus says. So I want to quote to you. Sean McDowell, who is a Christian apologist at Biola University, made this statement one time. He said, imagine if everybody lived by the sexual ethics of Jesus. There would be no more STDs, no abortions, no brokenness from divorce. Every child would have a mother and a father and experience the love and acceptance that each parent uniquely offers. There'd be no more rape, no sex abuse, no sex trafficking, no pornography, no need for a Me Too campaign, no sexual exploitation, no sex abuse, no AIDS, no herpes, no HPV, no syphilis, no unwanted pregnancies, no pain from divorce, no deadbeat dads, no men who leave their wives for another woman. No child would grow up in a household where dad left to do it his way. What McDowell is arguing is that to follow the teachings of Jesus is not a bondage. As John says in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 5, to love God is to obey him, and his commands are not a burden. To accept the authority of Jesus is to return to a form of innocence that says, I just want to do what my king says. And we discover life, we discover beauty, and we discover power when we submit our wills to the will of King Jesus. Let me say this. The last several decades with the work of Scott McKnight and N.T. Wright, we have come to realize that the kingdom of God had been neglected for a number of years by American evangelicals. But now that we've rediscovered the kingdom of God, I think we run the risk of failing to appreciate a great truth, which is simply this: if you don't have a king, you can't have a kingdom. Jesus comes not just to give us a kingdom, he comes to become our king. And to be king is to have all authority. Thank you.